So this is week 4 of Patrick Lecture 242, which is the spiritual meaning of political systems. And it was my observation so far this week that while it seemed like people were backing off a little bit from this lecture, I don't think they were backing off at all. I think it touched into a lot of resonances that are going on about authority, leadership, governance, and about personal process that, from my observation, I think it tied in. It doesn't always hit you over the head the way it ties in, although some processes this week were amazing uh, in that the things that came together. And as I told somebody, sometimes it helps to have an objective observer, a third person, a group, to be around because you may not realize what's going on in you until you get feedback from others. And that happened to me as well this week. I had my own unconscious stuff going on, and I had to realize it and focus and keep myself in line. So um, this section features politics in the New Age. Now, when I say this section features, I edit the lectures. I go through and rearrange passages. I try to make more of a narrative than sometimes the guide does, not because the lectures were wrong or need fixing, but that when you're presenting one section at a time, it's useful to gather up the materials that reference that aspect, rather than, I'm going to call it, as an example, stream of consciousness. That is sometimes the way the lectures flow. They go here and then they loop back around to this point. I find them poetic, magical, wonderful. But if I chop them into 4 pieces, that's hard to teach. So when I gather the materials, I rearrange. And so I rearranged into this section the guide's comments on politics in the New Age. And the natural question is, what would that look like? And the guide suggests it will look like what you want it to look like. That what will it look like is a kid question. That's how I phrase it. It's a kid question. Tell me what it looks like, and then I'll decide if I want it. Whereas this entire study of pathwork is about becoming your own leader, finding your own truth, owning it, standing up for it, and then figuring out what can be manifested, what can be brought forward, what are other people willing to support, because it is a cooperative effort and not everybody is on the same page at a given moment. That's also one of the ways I try to explain to couples when I would counsel couples a while back. When you team up with someone, we don't advance at the same pace. Sometimes someone advances or develops or explores far more aggressively or quicker than the other person. And when you look back, you can say they're holding me back, they're not interested, they're boring. That's a momentary snapshot. The idea is what I try to bring people's attention to is what brought you together in the first place, and to have some loving tolerance of the fact that the other person isn't moving at the same pace that you're moving at, and that there may be a gap for a period of time. And the question is, can you survive the gap lovingly, genuinely, or does the gap indicate something else, which is what the guide explores in his lecture on New Age marriage, sometimes saying there is a place where a marriage needs to end. Guide says the same thing about political systems and the same thing about wars. Wars on this planet sometimes are the only way through a difficulty. So coming back to politics in the New Age, the invitation that I would like to suggest is that you decide what you might think that is. What do you think we're capable of today that would stretch us a little but not strain us, that we could handle but we might need some support that isn't available in the moment. What is your ideal? And then how would you help us get there? Now, a lot of pathwork is about get yourself there first and then reach around and see if you can help the others gain that same ground. So I'm proposing that politics in the New Age is not a pie in the sky dreamy thing. It's a combination of practicality and idealism and longing and desire rolled up in one, and then we have to figure out how to get started. Interestingly, I started the week with a quote about the inner tyrant. And what I found this week was that really grabbed people. That really brought up things that they were working on. Why? Politics in the New Age means that we have to control ourselves. We have to manage ourselves. I can't be right all the time. I can't be in charge and just tell people what to do. That's not New Age politics. That's old style politics. It's a lot more work. There's a place in us that doesn't want to do that work. There's a place in us that wants to name it, put it in action, and go watch television. Name it, get it going, and go do what we want to do. Focus on our jobs and our careers and our families, but not constantly be involved all the time. And the analogy I gave this evening is I invite you to see human social activity in the same way that you see your corporal body. You don't just say, do it, I'll get back to you next week. The body doesn't stop. The body needs 24/7 maintenance of some kind. Now, a lot of it goes on automatically and you don't have to do anything specific, but it's happening. And when we fantasize about new systems, we can fantasize that we can let things grind to a halt, or freeze things in place, or do things a certain way, and it's not practical. Think in terms of the jokes you've always heard about business consultants. And in business, I was involved with several companies where consultants came in, and the majority of them, by necessity, could not foresee all the problems that would come from the good ideas that they were suggesting. In other words, it wasn't the idea that was the problem. It was the changeover to that idea. It was putting in place and bridging the gap and getting to that new place that was the problem. And they usually weren't around for that part. So that they would make recommendations and the boss would come back and say, this is what we have to do, but nobody spelled out how we were going to do that. And there wasn't usually a team. I was not working for enlightened companies. There was not a team in charge of helping you in a transitionary period. So in realizing the inner tyrant, part of the inner tyrant is the part of you that still wants duality, that wants a clear delineated line on what is right and what is wrong, that wants you to be on the right side. And if you happen to be on the side that you used to think was wrong, you will slowly convert to seeing that as the right side. I collect articles about biographies of people who have completely changed their political, social outlook, religious, whatever their main drive in life was. They have switched to another point of view entirely. And they are fascinating to read because, first of all, it takes a long time. You can't write this the day after you get an aha moment. You have to go through, and I call it pulling all the weeds of the old system that you've allowed to grow and foster in you. It will continue. Those habits of thinking, those ways of doing things will continue to go down the old habitual way. And you have to convert, so you have to constantly monitor those unconscious automatic processes that you yourself have put into action. It's as if you changed from Judaism to Christianity or Christianity to Judaism, they sound close to outsiders. To some people, they sound similar. A lot of differences. So many differences that you can almost sense. If you know either one deeply enough, you can sense how someone was raised and how they think, because there's a way of thinking that goes with the theology and the ideals and the way life is lived. Same thing is true of Muslims, same thing is true with Hindus. And that's why sometimes we feel that people of other cultures and other religions do not integrate well. They don't. They have a fundamentally different way of looking at the situation. Now, the one that I studied in detail was when I moved to Australia, and I studied the history of the Australians, trying to figure out the culture. And I knew enough to know that I needed to go deeper than what happened last week or 10 years ago. And so I studied the origins of how they grew and how they learned the land and how they interacted with the Aboriginal native culture. And one of the things that I found, well, two things. There was a historian named Geoffrey Blaney who wrote a beautiful book called The Tyranny of Distance. And I had not truly grasped what it meant to an Anglo culture to be so distant from its roots and having to reinvent things because there was no system already in place to help them. And so there was a tyranny to the distance that required a different approach. You couldn't do things the way you did them in England. The second thing that I learned was that the Aboriginal culture, thought process, religious, I don't have a word for it, please excuse me, was radically different than the Anglo settlers, the original Anglo settlers, on one key point that epitomizes the difference between them, and that is possessions. Sounds like a small thing. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and there's still a disparity on possessions in the actual languaging that goes on in how their families and villages and tribes interact and in what they accumulate. So that and as you can see in the background, I have my things and I have my way of doing things and I have things where I want them. In a culture where possessions are not yours, where the possessions are like the land, it belongs to everyone. These could be borrowed or moved or utilized. And it's not the same thing. Whereas I would be very offended if somebody came into my office and rearranged my stuff. But that's my mindset. I don't want to get lost here, but that's what I'm trying to describe, that there's an inner tyrant in us, and that when we talk about ideals and new ways of doing things, sometimes this unconscious lower self inner tyrant rears its head and says all the right words, but really just wants a solution, an answer. It wants to gain an advantage and hold it. And so the work, the daily work, the hourly work, is to recognize that, however you do it. There are tricks, there are techniques, there are systems, but there needs to be the will to do this. There needs to be a will to see and a willingness to appreciate that something else might be needed that could cost us our experience, our advantage, our status as the so-called experts or the leaders. That going into new territories can sometimes mean everybody's now on the same footing for a while as we all gather this information. And this is what sometimes inhibits us from being creative and being cooperative, so that politics in the new age can't operate without this fundamental aspect of us being looked at, examined, and released. So, a bit long-winded this week, but that's my take on politics in the new age and how we get there and what might be required. Thanks for listening. Hope you read the lecture.